He stood in front of the cameras and connected the treatment of this woman to the death of Harry's mother. He used the one word that matters most to that family. And then, 6 years later, he simply vanished from their lives without a single word of explanation. That is the part I want you to sit with for a moment. The most publicly committed celebrity defender the Sussexes ever had did not storm off. He did not give an interview. He did not pick a fight on a red carpet or trade insults in a magazine. He just stopped answering. And by the time anyone noticed, the friendship that once looked like one of the most significant celebrity alliances of the post-royal era had already quietly dissolved into nothing. Here is the loop I'm going to close for you by the end. There is one specific detail in the reporting about how this ended, one small word buried in the accounts that tells you exactly why this hurt Harry more than any feud ever could. I will hand it to you at the close. Stay with me, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And before we go anywhere, let me put you inside Harry's shoes for just a moment, because I think it changes how you hear the whole story. Imagine you have left behind the only world you have ever known. Imagine you have walked away from the institution that raised you, crossed an ocean, and bet everything on the idea that a new world will catch you. Now imagine the single most powerful man in that new world stands up in public and not only catches you, but invokes the most sacred and painful loss of your entire life to defend the person you love most. You would think, surely, that man is mine for life. You would build on him, you would assume the wall would hold. That assumption is the quiet tragedy at the heart of everything I am about to tell you. Let me tell you who we are actually talking about, because the name carries weight that most people underestimate. George Clooney is not someone who quietly disappears from anything. He has spent 3 decades in public life being the precise opposite of subtle, politically vocal, publicly committed. Willing to put his name on positions and on people in front of cameras when most of his peers would manage their risk far more carefully. His career across film, philanthropy, and political engagement is stuffed with moments where he chose the harder road and said the thing that cost something, when staying quiet would have been considerably easier and professionally safer. And I will be honest with you about how I feel watching this unfold. There is something almost poetic about it. The Sussexes built a reputation, fairly or not, as people who go quiet on those who no longer serve the brand, the ones who tend to do the ghosting. So the fact that they now appear to be the ones being ghosted by a man who once defended them in the most public way imaginable lands as a particular kind of justice. Not nice, not pleasant, but richly, almost comically deserved. Now hold that thought, because the story only gets stranger the deeper we go. In the year 2019, this man compared the media treatment of Meghan to the coverage that preceded the death of Diana. He called it unfair in plain, unambiguous language, directly in front of the cameras. He did not hedge it, he did not soften it. He reached for the comparison that he knew would cut deepest, and he attached it to an argument about what was being done to a pregnant woman under sustained public pressure. That was not a casual celebrity endorsement. That was a man placing his reputation on the line because he had concluded the situation demanded it. And then, roughly 6 years later, according to multiple reports, he is no longer in the picture in any observable way. No public fallout, no interview where he explains the distance. No dramatic confrontation that anyone can point to as the defining moment when things changed. The alliance that looked at its peak, like one of the most consequential celebrity friendships of the entire post-royal chapter, appears to have simply and very quietly evaporated. And according to sources cited in recent reporting, Harry never saw it coming, which I think may be the detail that makes the whole thing most painful for him. But we are not there yet. Keep that promise in your pocket. Tonight, we are going through the full story, beginning to end. How the friendship formed and what it represented at its peak. What that 2019 defense of Meghan actually cost and why it mattered. What the King's Trust appearance in the year 2023 signaled about the direction this famous couple were quietly steering their own institutional standing. What the apparent cooling of this one specific relationship reveals about the much larger question of where the Sussex celebrity network actually stands now. 6 years after the departure that was supposed to open every door in Hollywood and prove that the California chapter would be better than the royal one. And underneath all of it sits a single uncomfortable question. When the most publicly committed celebrity defender of the Sussex position appears to have silently withdrawn, what exactly does that communicate about the overall picture? Let me show you. And let me start where the connection first became visible to the world. The wedding. Picture it, the month of May in the year 2018, St. George's Chapel. The guest list for that wedding was genuinely extraordinary. One of those rare events where the sheer density of famous names packed into a single room became a story in its own right. And among them, George and Amal Clooney. At the time, their presence carried a specific kind of weight that went well beyond ordinary celebrity. These two were not simply famous. They were, at that moment, among the most globally influential couples alive. Him, through decades of film, philanthropy, and political engagement that regularly placed him in the same rooms as heads of state and international institutions. Her, through a career as an international human rights lawyer working at the very highest levels. Think about what that means. Their attendance was not the attendance of people chasing proximity to fame. It was the attendance of people who were already operating in a world where the royal family was simply one institution among many that they moved through, professionally and socially. Their presence said something precise. The Sussexes had arrived at the very highest tier of the global elite, not merely the entertainment world, the actual top of the mountain. And then it deepened. Months after the wedding, Harry and Meghan were reportedly invited to this man's villa on the shore of Lake Como, one of the most private and coveted addresses on the planet among the genuinely wealthy and influential. Understand what that invitation represents. That villa is not a place celebrities go to be photographed. It is a place people go when they want to be truly, completely out of public view. To be invited there is not the courtesy you extend to an acquaintance from a wedding. It signals a depth of connection that goes far beyond having simply stood in the same chapel on the same afternoon. And here is a detail I find quietly telling. Even as the friendship reportedly grew close, this famous couple never once allowed themselves to be photographed publicly alongside Harry and Meghan after the wedding itself. Yes, they turned up at St. George's Chapel for the world to see. But the cozy, casual public photograph that announces an ongoing celebrity friendship, it never came. From their side, I would call that a wise instinct, possibly a revealing one. File it away. We will come back to what that restraint might have meant. Now, into the year 2019. As Meghan faced sustained and increasingly ferocious media scrutiny during her pregnancy, this man went public with his support, and he did not do it gently. He drew the parallel to Diana directly. He said the press was repeating the exact same thing it had done before, driving a woman toward the same terrible end. That is not a careful celebrity hedge dressed up as concern. That is a direct, deliberate statement from someone who understood precisely how much weight those particular words carried and chose to carry them out loud anyway. For Harry, those words must have reached somewhere most public support never could. This was a man connecting the treatment of his wife to the events that ended his mother's life in front of the cameras. With his name attached, if there was ever a single moment designed to prove that this friendship was durable, that it was built on something real rather than on the prestige of a wedding invitation, that was the moment. And let me sit on the cost of that for a second, because I think it is easy to underrate. When a famous person offers vague, comfortable support, they risk almost nothing. A kind word costs you nothing. A safe statement costs you nothing. But this was not that. To reach for Diana, by name, in that context, was to spend real reputational capital. It was to invite the accusation of exploiting a tragedy. It was to stake a position so specific that he could never quietly walk it back later without everyone noticing. He did not have to go that far. The safe move was to say nothing, or to say something soft and forgettable. He chose the unsafe move. He chose the one that could not be taken back, which is exactly what makes the silence that followed so loud. You cannot spend that much capital defending someone in the year 2019 and then, a few years later, go completely quiet during their loudest controversies and have that silence mean nothing. The size of the original gesture is what gives the later absence its weight. A whisper that stops is barely noticed. A man who once shouted and then says nothing at all is the most deafening silence in the room. So here's the question that defines everything that follows. What on earth happened? Before I answer, do me one small favor. If this channel is giving you the full picture that the others skip past, tap that like button. It genuinely helps us keep doing exactly this kind of work, and it costs you nothing at all. Now, what happened? The honest answer, to the extent there is a public one, is that nobody knows with certainty. Neither half of this famous couple has publicly addressed the reported cooling. Harry and Meghan have not spoken about it directly either. What we have instead is what stopped being visible. And that, in its own way, tells a story. After Harry and Meghan relocated to California in the year 2020, the public signs of this particular friendship did not grow. They shrank, and then they disappeared altogether. No joint appearances, no photographs together in any public setting, no major events attended side by side as couples. None of the small mutual acknowledgements that famous people use constantly to signal an ongoing relationship. The casual tag, the congratulatory comment, the quiet presence in each other's public orbit that communicates closeness without ever requiring a formal announcement. Gone. All of it. The late Como era and the 2019 defense of Meghan became the high water mark of the public friendship. Everything after was silence. And it was a silence that grew steadily louder as the Sussex controversies multiplied, each new one passing without his voice attached to it. Here's the part most people get completely wrong. They assume a friendship like this must end with a bang, a betrayal, a leaked text, a furious phone call. But according to reporting that has circulated across royal commentary and entertainment outlets in the years since, the truth was far quieter and, I would argue, far crueler. Harry, by these accounts, made attempts to reconnect over the years, and the picture that emerged from those reports was of communication becoming gradually harder and harder to maintain. Messages left unanswered for stretches of time, meetings and events discussed but somehow never quite materializing. Interactions, when they did happen, described as polite, but carrying none of the warmth of the earlier period. Not hostile, not confrontational. Just empty. In the very specific way, a relationship becomes empty when one side has quietly made a decision and the other side has not yet been told why. That texture matters enormously, the slow fade rather than the clean rupture. According to multiple accounts, that is precisely what made it so difficult for Harry to process. And here I want to bring in something from psychology, because it explains the particular ache of this far better than any royal gossip ever could. There is a reason the human mind handles a clean ending so much better than a slow one. A clean ending gives you a story. It hands you a beginning, a middle, and a close, and your mind can file it away as finished. But the slow fade denies you the close. It leaves the loop open. Your mind keeps reaching back to it, replaying the last warm conversation, scanning it for the moment things tipped, hunting for the sentence you might have said differently. The fade does not let you grieve because grief needs a death, and the fade never gives you a body. It just gives you a phone that stops lighting up. That is the specific cruelty Harry was reportedly left holding. Not anger. Anger would have been cleaner, just the open loop, the unanswered why. Think about it from inside his position for a second. A public feud can be addressed. A misunderstanding can be corrected. A falling out can generate its own resolution, if both people actually want one. But when someone you trusted simply becomes unavailable, with no stated reason, there is nothing to respond to, no clear path to finding out what went wrong. The friendship just quietly slides over time into the past tense. A fact. Something that used to be true. And here is why this particular fade carries more weight than almost any other. This man had been the single most visible, most public defender the Sussexes had. He set a standard of loyalty in the year 2019 that made his later silence ring louder than anyone else's silence ever could. When a person publicly connects the treatment of your wife to the death of your mother and then simply stops being reachable, that absence does not feel neutral. It feels like a verdict. So let me put a question to you directly, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think this couple made a cold, calculated decision to step back? Or do you think the friendship simply ran its natural course under extraordinary pressure? Tell me. I read them, and the debate on this one is always worth having. Now, let us talk about the King's Trust. Because the King's Trust Award's appearance in the year 2023 is the moment that crystallized the symbolic dimension of this whole story in a way that became very, very hard to ignore. By the time this famous couple attended that event, the public Sussex narrative had already moved through several enormous chapters. The Oprah interview in the year 2021, the streaming documentary in the year 2022, and Harry's memoir titled Spare at the very start of the year 2023, which generated global headlines and dramatically escalated the institutional tensions. Each chapter had produced fresh controversy. Each one had pushed specific claims about specific family members into the permanent public record. The memoir in particular was extraordinary in its specificity. Private conversations, personal grievances, characterizations of family members suddenly available to anyone who could walk into a bookshop. And into that exact context stepped George and Amal Clooney, appearing at a major event connected to the charitable work of King Charles, not at a Sussex event, not at the premiere of anything tied to Harry and Meghan. At the King's Trust Awards, a prestigious, visible occasion directly linked to the very institution Harry had spent the previous 3 years publicly describing as one that had failed him and harmed him. Now, did they make a statement about the Sussexes? No. They explained nothing in terms of any shift in allegiance. They simply attended an event they presumably found worthwhile, shook hands with people they knew, and carried on with their lives. For a couple who move constantly through international philanthropic and institutional circles, that is entirely unremarkable behavior. But here is the thing about symbolism. It does not require a press release. Royal commentators did not need anyone to spell it out. The meaning of the choice was visible, and it was noticed. While Harry was publicly characterizing the royal family as an institution that had caused him profound harm, one of the celebrity couples he had reportedly considered close friends was attending a prestigious event tied to his own father, the king. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not ignored. Whether they intended that contrast or simply made an independent decision about an event they valued, the effect on the public narrative around the Sussex celebrity network was real, and it was significant. It became one of the clearest data points yet in a reading of the situation that had been building across multiple sources for years. The reading being this: the Hollywood figures who once appeared to orbit the Sussexes were quietly making different calculations about where their public association ought to be pointing. And that bridge takes us somewhere important, because the Clooney story does not exist in isolation. To understand it, you have to widen the lens. So let me widen it for you. And what you are about to see is a pattern. The wedding guest list in the year 2018 was loaded with names across entertainment, sport, and media, names that generated their own headlines the moment they were announced. David Beckham attended, alongside Victoria. Idris Elba performed at the reception as a disc jockey. Serena Williams gave a speech at the celebration afterward. The sheer density of famous faces created a powerful impression. Here was a couple at the apparent peak of their influence, a couple who had successfully fused the worlds of royalty and Hollywood, who had access to absolutely everyone, who were building something culturally significant that would surely only grow larger with time. 6 years on, the observable picture looks considerably different from that glittering first impression. Watch the names with me. David Beckham. In the years 2024 and 2025, his name is far more likely to surface in coverage connected to King Charles, to William, to Catherine, to the broader royal charitable world than in anything connected to Harry and Meghan. Reports of tension around the Invictus Games, specifically the account of Beckham traveling to an event and discovering the warmth he expected simply was not waiting for him, have circulated persistently enough across multiple sources to harden into accepted narrative. Idris Elba, his public professional connections to charitable organizations and royal-linked initiatives tied to the monarchy remain visible in his current coverage. His public connection to Harry and Meghan, by contrast, is generating almost nothing of note today. Serena Williams, once described as Meghan's most genuine and enduring celebrity friendship, someone whose public loyalty had been tested and appeared to be the real thing, has gone noticeably quiet in the most recent stretch of the Sussex story. And then there is the figure who sits at the very apex of this conversation, Oprah, whose involvement with the Sussexes was more visible and more consequential than almost anyone else on that entire guest list. She has not chosen Meghan's children's book for her famous book club. She has not publicly attached herself to any significant later Sussex project. A seasoned royal commentator characterized the current dynamic with this figure in a way I find precise and a little chilling, close enough to stay connected to the story if something major develops, far enough away to avoid being dragged into the ongoing fallout. That is the careful posture of someone who covers this world with genuine sourcing and no obvious axe to grind in any direction. Now, let me be careful here, because there is a lazy version of this analysis and I refuse to give it to you. The pattern, when you actually look at it across all these cases, is not that every single celebrity from the wedding circle made a deliberate, coordinated decision to march toward the royal family and away from the Sussexes. That reading would be far too neat, too tidy, too conspiracy-shaped to be true. Individual famous people make individual choices for individual reasons, and not all of those reasons are remotely the same. What the pattern actually shows is something quieter and in some ways far more telling than any coordinated plot. Let me lay it out as a kind of scorecard, because seeing it side by side is when it really hits you. Take the brightest names from that 2018 guest list and ask one simple question of each. Where does their public association point now? Beckham, drifting toward the senior royals, dogged by reports of Invictus tension. Elba, visibly tied to monarchy-linked charitable work, near silent on the Sussexes. Serena Williams, once the gold standard of genuine Sussex loyalty, gone quiet. Oprah, hovering at a careful, calculated distance, neither in nor out. And Clooney, the loudest defender of them all, vanished into total stillness. 5 of the brightest names. 5 different stories. And yet, read down the column, one direction repeats. Away. In every single case, away. No conspiracy is required to explain a pattern like that. Only gravity. Only the simple fact that, over time, things drift toward where the weight already is. And the weight, it turns out, was never in Montecito. The celebrities who were once most publicly associated with the Sussexes are simply no longer generating public associations with the Sussexes. The connection that once defined how they were perceived in relation to one another has stopped being visible. No joint appearances getting covered, no public acknowledgments being made, no contemporary evidence of the kind of active social relationship that normally produces a steady drip of coverage when a celebrity friendship is genuinely functioning. And for the Sussexes, that evaporation is a fundamentally different kind of problem than a public falling out. Think about why. A public falling out is a story with 2 sides, and 2-sided stories always generate coverage you can engage with, respond to, steer, but the quiet disappearance of connection gives you nothing to push against. There is no opponent, no accusation, no claim to rebut. It simply leaves you holding a guest list from the year 2018 that looks dramatically different from the social world actually surrounding you in the year 2025, with no obvious mechanism for changing the picture. Let that sit for a beat, because it leads directly to the harder question. Was this friendship ever built on a foundation strong enough to survive what came after the wedding? Here is a reading that many commentators have landed on, and I think it deserves serious weight. The wedding in the year 2018 was not simply a private gathering between old, established friends. It was one of the most prestigious ceremonial events of the entire decade. The kind of occasion that generates invitations tied to status, to spectacle, to institutional prestige, rather than exclusively to deep prior friendship. George and Amal Clooney did not arrive at that chapel with a long-established bond with Harry and Meghan already behind them. They were not childhood friends. They were not two people who had weathered years of shared experience together. Their attendance was part of a guest list that blended genuine, long-standing personal relationships with people invited precisely because the scale and cultural significance of the occasion made their presence appropriate and mutually valuable. And let me be clear, that is not a criticism, not of this couple, not of Harry and Meghan. It is simply an honest description of what a royal wedding on that scale actually is. A cultural event every bit as much as a personal celebration. One that generates its own social dynamics, where the guest list reflects both real affection and the prestige of the moment, mixed in proportions only the people standing inside that chapel could ever fully know. Which is exactly why what came afterward was so meaningful, because it went further than the occasion required. This man did not have to speak out in the year 2019. The wedding did not obligate him to it. He chose to. The Lake Como invitation, the public defense of Meghan in front of the cameras, those gestures suggested that what began as a prestigious social connection had matured into something with real loyalty behind it. But then the years arrived, and they tested that loyalty in ways the 2019 defense could never have anticipated. The Oprah interview, the streaming documentary, the memoir titled Spare, these were not minor escalations in the Sussex story. They were major commercial and public interventions, each one adding to a permanent public record of claims about specific family members. Each one keeping the Sussex story locked in a state of continuous controversy, generating endless cycles of coverage that placed everyone in the Sussex orbit in the same uncomfortable position. Either you engage or you conspicuously do not. And this famous couple, whose entire brand is built on prestige, on stability, on carefully cultivated institutional relationships, and a particular kind of global credibility that takes decades to build, move through all of it without publicly distancing themselves from the Sussexes, but also without publicly re-engaging. They did not criticize. They did not defend. They stayed perfectly still. And in the space of that stillness, the friendship, if it was even still functioning, became invisible. Now, here is the insight I want to drive home, and it is the single most revealing thing in this entire story. The silence itself was a statement, and it carried a very specific weight precisely because of who was staying silent. This is a man who speaks out publicly when he cares about something. He has done it again and again across his entire career. On genocide in Darfur, on press freedom, on political corruption. Speaking up is not occasional for him. It is a defining habit. It is who he is. And that man chose not to speak out during a single one of the Sussex controversies that followed his 2019 defense of Meghan, not during the fallout from the Oprah interview, not during the streaming documentary coverage, not during the publication of the memoir, not during any of the legal battles. Read that carefully, because here is the logic that I think is inescapable. George Clooney staying silent about something he cares about is not a pattern his career supports. It almost never happens. But George Clooney staying silent about something he has moved past, something he has quietly closed the door on, is a pattern entirely consistent with who he is and how he operates. In other words, the silence was not neutral. The silence was the message. And what does this whole story ultimately represent in the wider arc of Harry's post-royal life? Something specific and something genuinely uncomfortable. The possibility that the Hollywood relationships, which looked most durable in the year 2020, were actually built on a foundation that required certain conditions to keep holding, the conditions changed, and the relationships did not survive the change. Harry moved to California expecting Hollywood to become a permanent, stable alternative to the royal world he had walked away from. And on its face, that assumption was reasonable. Hollywood is full of people who understand public scrutiny intimately, people who manage complex institutional relationships every day, people with the cultural and financial resources to maintain connections across complicated terrain. It looked like a world that would embrace the Sussexes on their own terms. What that assumption may not have fully reckoned with is that Hollywood relationships carry their own particular logic. Partly genuine personal connection, yes, but also partly brand alignment, and partly a cold, ongoing calculation about what the costs and benefits of proximity look like at any given moment. This couple are not simply famous people who happen to be well-known. They are people with a meticulously managed global presence, active institutional relationships with the organizations that matter to them professionally and philanthropically, and a powerful incentive to be extremely precise about where their public associations point. Their appearance at the King's Trust Awards was almost certainly not a deliberate strike against Harry. There is no evidence it was meant as a statement at all. In all likelihood, it was simply an event they found worthwhile, attended on its own merits, and thought no further about. But it demonstrated something the move to California may not have prepared Harry for: that the celebrities he expected to become his network were, the entire time, busy maintaining their own networks. And those networks had not quietly reorganized themselves around the Sussex arrival. Here is the line I keep coming back to: Hollywood did not move to Montecito. The Sussexes moved to Hollywood. And in Hollywood, the people who define the social architecture, who set the terms, who decide who gets the invitations, who control the symbolic capital of any given room, are the people who were already there long before you arrived, and who will still be there long after you are gone. Let me make that point land with something from a completely different world, because I think it is the truest way to understand what happened here. Think about how royal courts have actually worked for centuries. When a new figure arrives at a court, an exiled prince, a foreign bride, a sudden favorite, everyone around them performs warmth. The bows are deep, the smiles are wide, the invitations flow. But the warmth is not loyalty, it is positioning. The courtiers are reading the room, measuring whether this new arrival will rise or fall, and quietly adjusting how close they stand based on which way the wind is blowing. The ones who survive at court for decades are precisely the ones who never mistake warmth for commitment. Hollywood is a court. It has always been a court, and the Sussexes arrived in it as the most glamorous new favorites of the season. The bows were deep, the smiles were wide. For a moment, the whole court seemed to turn toward them, but a court does not reorganize itself around a newcomer, no matter how dazzling. The court waits, it watches, and when the controversies began to stack, the courtiers did exactly what courtiers have always done. They did not denounce, they did not rebel. They simply, one by one, took a quiet half step back and let the distance do the talking. That is what you are watching. Not a betrayal, a courtier's retreat. And the most accomplished courtier in the room, the one with the deepest bow and the warmest early smile, was the man who once stood in front of the cameras and spoke the name Diana. So let me bring it all home now. Let me close every loop I opened. The friendship that began in the year 2018 with a wedding invitation, that deepened through a visit to Lake Como and a public defense of Meghan in front of the cameras, was real at the time it existed. I do not doubt that for a moment. And the observable evaporation of that friendship is also real. By every measurable public indicator, it has not survived in any visible form into the year 2025. What happened in between those 2 points? What exact sequence of events, decisions, or gradual drifts carried this friendship from its 2019 peak to its present absence? That is known only to the people who lived it. But what it demonstrates publicly is the same thing the Sussex story has been quietly illustrating for years now. That the social and professional architecture Harry and Meghan built around their post-royal identity, impressive as it looked while it was going up, has not proven anywhere near as durable as it appeared when the first bricks were being laid. The celebrity relationships meant to form the foundation of the post-royal chapter have, one by one, stopped producing the kind of visible evidence that foundations are supposed to provide. This couple were meant to be one of the load-bearing walls of that whole structure. The 2019 defense of Meghan was meant to be the kind of public commitment that endures for a lifetime. The Lake Como invitation was meant to be the gesture that cements something permanent. And by every observable measure, they appear to no longer be in the building at all. Now, the promise I made you at the very start. The one small detail that, for me, makes this the saddest version of the story it could possibly be. It is the word never. As in, according to the reporting, Harry never saw it coming. Sit with that, a public feud you can see approaching, a betrayal announces itself. A leaked text, an angry interview, a slammed door, those at least give you a moment of warning, a chance to brace. But Harry got none of it. The man who had compared the treatment of his wife to the death of his mother, the man who opened the doors of the most private villa in the world to him, did not slam anything. He simply, gradually, gently became unreachable, and by the time Harry understood it was over, it had already been over for a long time. That is the cruelty of the slow fade. There is no moment to point at, no villain to name, just a friendship that was there, and then, somehow, was not. And if you want the lesson buried underneath all of it, here it is, as plainly as I can put it. Loyalty that is loud is not the same as loyalty that lasts. The most public defender is not always the most durable one. Sometimes the grandest gesture is also the most fragile, precisely because it was tied to a moment, and moments end. The friendships that survive are rarely the ones announced in front of cameras. They are the quiet ones, the ones with no audience, the ones that were never performing for anyone in the first place. Harry, by these accounts, built on the loud one, and the loud ones, it turns out, are the first to go quiet. So, which theory do you actually find most convincing? A deliberate recalibration by this famous couple, reading the room and quietly stepping back? A natural drift, driven by the accumulating weight of one Sussex controversy after another? Or simply two people whose friendship ran its full course inside a compressed period of extraordinary public pressure? There is no version of this story with a clean answer. And anyone who tells you there is has picked a side rather than read the evidence. So drop your honest take below. I genuinely read them, and on this topic, the debate is always a good one. The story, as ever, keeps moving, and here is what I will leave you watching for. The next test is already on the calendar because there is always another premiere, another gala, another awards night where these worlds collide. And the question that will tell you everything is brutally simple. When the next prestigious room fills up, whose name appears on the guest list and whose name does not? Watch the rooms. The rooms never lie. When the next chapter lands, I will be right here ready to walk you through it because something tells me this one is far from finished.